Spirituals. Spirituals, also known as Negro spirituals, Black spirituals, or spiritual music, is a genre of Christian music that is purely and solely the creation of generations of Black Americans, 1317, which merged African cultural heritage with the experiences of being held in bondage in slavery, at first during the transatlantic slave. Spirituals encompass the sing-songs, work songs, and plantation songs that evolved into the blues and gospel songs in church. In the 19th century, the word spirituals referred to all these subcategories of folk songs. While they were often rooted in biblical stories, they also described the extreme hardships endured by African Americans who were enslaved from the 17th century until the 1860s, the emancipation altering mainly the nature but not continuation of slavery for many. Many new derivative music genres emerged from the spirituals songcraft. Prior to the end of the U.S. Civil War and emancipation, spirituals were originally an oral tradition passed from one slave generation to the next. Biblical stories were memorized, then translated into song. Following emancipation, the lyrics of spirituals were published in printed form. Ensembles such as the Fisk Jubilee Singers, established in 1871, popularized spirituals, bringing them to a wider, even international audience. At first, major recording studios were only recording white musicians performing spirituals and their derivatives. That changed with Mamie Smith's commercial success in 1920. Starting in the 1920s, the commercial recording industry increased the audience for the spirituals and their derivatives. Black composers Harry Burleigh and R. Nathaniel Dett created a new repertoire for the concert stage by applying their Western classical education to the spirituals. While the spirituals were created by a circumscribed community of people in bondage, over time they became known as the first signature music of the United States. Terminology. The New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, one of the largest reference works on music and musicians, 284-290 itemized and described spiritual in their electronic resource, Grove Music Online, an important part of Oxford Music Online, as a type of sacred song created by and for African Americans that originated in or. They use the term without the descriptor, African American. The term spirituals is a 19th century word used for songs with religious texts created by African slaves in America. The first published book of slave songs referred to them as spirituals. In musicology and ethnomusicology in the 1990s, the single term spirituals is used to describe the Spirituals Project. The U.S. Library of Congress uses the phrase African American spirituals for the numbered and itemized entry. In the introductory phrase, the singular form is used without the adjective African American. Throughout the encyclopedic entry, the singular and plural form of the term is used without the African American descriptor. The LOC introductory sentence says, "A spiritual is a type of religious folk song that is most closely associated with the enslavement of African people in the American South." Context. The transatlantic slave trade, which took place over 400 years, was the largest and most inhumane forced migration in recorded human history. Most were taken from the West African coast to the Americas. From 1501 through 1867, approximately 12.5 million Africans from almost every country within Atlantic coastline were kidnapped and coerced into slavery, according to the 2015 atlas based on about 35,000 slaving voyages. Roughly 6% of all enslaved Africans transported via the slave trade arrived in the United States, both before and after the colonial era. The majority of these Africans came from the West African slave coast. The domestic slave trade that emerged after the United States Congress outlawed the international slave trade in 1808 and lasted until the U.S. Civil War destroyed generations of African American families. Slavery in the United States differed from the institution in other regions of the Americas, such as the West Indies, Dutch Guiana, and Brazil, where the majority of enslaved Africans were sent as part of the slave trade. In the U.S., there was a high and sustained natural increase in the slave population for more than a century and a half, with numbers nearly tripling by the end of the domestic slave trade in the 1860s. During that period, approximately 1.2 million men, women, and children, the vast majority of whom were born in America, were displaced. Spouses were separated from one another, and parents were separated from their children. By 1850, most enslaved African Americans were third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. In the 1800s, the majority of enslaved people in the British West Indies and Brazil had been born in Africa, whereas in the United States, they were generations removed from Africa. The institution of slavery ended with the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War in 1865. The first enslaved Africans had arrived on current U.S. soil in 1526, making landfall in present-day Winnea Bay, South Carolina, in a short-lived colony called San Miguel de Gualdape. They were the first to stage a slave rebellion. In 1619, the first slave ship had carried 20 people from the West Central African Kingdom of Congo to a life of enslavement in what is now Mexico. The Kingdom of Congo at that time stretched over an area of 60,000 miles, 97,000 km, in the watershed of the Congo River, the longest river in Africa, and had a population of 2.5 million, was one of the largest Africa. For a brief period, King Jogo I of Congo, who reigned from 1470 to 1509, had voluntarily converted to Catholicism, and for close to 3 centuries, from 1491 to 1750, the Kingdom of Congo had practiced Christianity and was an independent and cosmopolitan realm. The descendants of the rice plantation enslaved Gullah people, whose country of origin is Sierra Leone, were unique because they had been much more isolated on the islands off the coast of South Carolina. Gullah spirituals are sung in a Creole language that was influenced by African American vernacular English, with the majority of African words coming from the Akan, Yoruba, and Igbo. Overview. Overview. In his 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, an essay on abolition, and a memoir, Frederick Douglass, 1818–1895, a great orator, described slave songs as telling a tale which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep, breathing the prayer and complaint. His narrative, which is the most famous of the stories written by former slaves at that time, is one of the most influential pieces of literature that acted as a catalyst in the early years of the American abolitionist movement, according to the Auckland entry. Slave songs were called sorrow songs by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. Hansonia Caldwell, the author of African American Music, Spirituals, The Fundamental Communal Music of Black Americans and African American Music, A Chronology, 1619–1995, said that spirituals sustained Africans when they were enslaved. She described them as code songs that would announce meetings, as in Steal Away, and described the path for running away, as in Follow the Drinking Gourd. Go Down Moses referred to Harriet Tubman, that was her nickname, so that when they heard that song, they knew she was coming to the area. I often call the spiritual an omnibus term because there are lots of different subcategories under it. They used to sing songs as they worked in the fields. In the church, it evolved into the gospel song. In the fields, it became Hansonia Caldwell, who was a professor of music at California State University, Dominguez Hills, CSUD, from 1972 to 2011, also oversaw an archive of sacred music at CSUD, an extensive collection of music, books, periodicals, documents, audio and visual materials, and oral histories. The African American spiritual, also called the Negro spiritual, constitutes one of the largest and most significant forms of American folk song, according to a Library of Congress 2016 article. Spirituals were originally oral, but by 1867 the first compilation, entitled Slave Songbook, was published. In the book's preface, one of the co-compilers, William Francis Allen traced the development of Negro spirituals and cultural connections to Africa. The 1867 publication included spirituals that were well known and regularly sung in American churches, but whose origins in plantations had not been acknowledged. Allen wrote that it was almost impossible to convey the spirituals in print because of the inimitable quality of African American voices with its intonations and delicate variations, where not even one singer can be reproduced on paper. Allen described the complexity of songs such as I Can't Stay Behind, My Lord or Turn, Sinner, Turn O, which have a complicated shout where there are no singing parts, and no two singers appear to be singing the same thing. The lead singer starts the words of each verse, often improvising, and the others, who bass him as it is called, strike in with the refrain or even join in the solo when the words are familiar. In their 1925 book, The Books of American Negro Spirituals, James Weldon Johnson and Grace Nail Johnson said that spirituals, which are purely and solely the creation of African Americans, represent America's only type of folk music. The couple were active during the Harlem Renaissance. James Weldon Johnson was the leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People (NAACP). In 1993, Arthur C. Jones, a University of Denver professor in the musicology, ethnomusicology and theory department, the Spirituals Project in 1998 at the university's Lamont School of Music, to preserve and revitalize the music and teachings of the sacred folk songs called spirituals created and first sung by African Americans in slavery. Spirituals were created by a circumscribed community of people in bondage. Over time, they became known as the first signature music of the United States. Forbidden to speak their native languages, they generally converted to Christianity. With narrow vocabularies, they used the words they did know to translate biblical information and facts from their other sources into song. Cultural origins. African Foundation. J. H. Quaidna, in Kesha 1921-2019, described by the New York Times in 2019 as a preeminent scholar of African music, said in 1973 that there is an important, interdependent dynamic and unbroken conceptual relationship between African and African American music. 715 enslaved African Americans in the plantation South drew on native rhythms and their African heritage. According to a May 2012 PBS interview, spirituals were religious folk songs, often rooted in biblical stories, woven together, sung, and passed along from one slave generation to another. According to Walter Pitt's 1996 book, spirituals are a musical form that is indigenous and specific to the religious experience African slaves and their descendants in the United States. Pitt said that they were a result of the interaction of music and religion from Africa with music and religion of European origin. 74 in a May 2012 PBS interview, Uzzy Brown Jr. said that spirituals were the survival tools for the African slave. Brown said that while other similarly oppressed cultures were virtually wiped out, the African slave survived because of spirituals by singing through many of their problems, by creating their own way of communicating. Enslaved people introduced a number of new instruments to America, the bones body percussion, and an instrument variously called the bania, banjo, or banjar, a precursor to the banjo but without frets. They brought with them from Africa long-standing religious traditions that highlighted the importance of storytelling. Evidence of the vital role African music has played in the creation of African American spirituals exists, among other elements, in the use of complex rhythms and polyrhythms from West Africa. 715. Religion in everyday life. According to the beliefs of slave religion, the material and the spiritual are part of an intrinsic unity. Music, religion, and everyday life are inseparable in the spirituals, and through them, religious ideals were infused into the activities of everyday life. 372. The spirituals provided some immunity, protecting the African American religion from being colonized, and in this way preserved the sacred as a potential space of resistance. 372, a 2015 article in the Journal of Black Studies said that it was not surprising, therefore, that spirituals were sung primarily as rowing songs, field songs, work songs, and social songs, rather than exclusively within the church. 372. The article described how, through the use of metonymy, 372 in William Eliezer Barton's 1899–1972 Old Plantation Hymns, the author wrote that African American hymns seldom make allusion to the Bible as a source of inspiration. They prefer heart religion to book religion. Barton, who attended services with African Americans, said that they did not sing the ordinary hymns. He cites the examples of We Are Some of the Praying People and a hymn from Alabama, Wear a Starry Crown. He also notes that both these songs have a threefold repetition and a concluding line. 16. In the latter, we find the familiar swing and syncopation of the African American. Spirituals were not simply different versions of hymns or Bible stories, but rather a creative altering of the material, new melodies and music, refashioned text, and stylistic differences helped to set apart the music as distinctly African American. The first great biblical themes, by the 17th century, enslaved Africans were familiar with Christian biblical stories, such as the story of Moses and Daniel, seeing their own stories reflected in them. An Africanized form of Christianity evolved in the slave population, with African American spirituals providing a way to express the community's new faith, as well as its sorrows and hopes. As Africans were exposed to stories from the Bible, they began to see parallels to their own experiences. The story of the exile of the Jews and their captivity in Babylon resonated with their own captivity. The lyrics of Christian spirituals reference symbolic aspects of biblical images such as Moses and Israel's exodus from Egypt in songs such as Michael Row the Boat Ashore. There is also a duality in the lyrics of spirituals. They communicated many Christian ideals while also communicating the hardship that was a result of being an enslaved. The River Jordan in traditional African American religious song became a symbolic borderland not only between this world and the next. It could also symbolize travel to the north and freedom, or could signify a proverbial border from the status of slavery to living free. Syncopation, or ragged time, was a natural part of spiritual music. Songs were played on African-inspired instruments. Collections of lyrics of the spirituals. African American spirituals have associations with plantation songs, slave songs, freedom songs, and songs of the Underground Railway, and were oral until the end of the U.S. Civil War. Following the Civil War and emancipation, there has been extensive collection and preservation of spirituals as folk song tradition. The first collection of Negro spirituals was published in 1867, 2 years after the war had ended. Entitled Slave Songs of the United States, it was compiled by 3 Northern abolitionists, Charles Pickard, where 1840–1921. Most of the 1867 book consisted of songs gathered directly from African Americans. By the 1830s at least, plantation songs, genuine slave songs, and Negro melodies had become extraordinarily popular. Eventually, spurious imitations for more sentimental tastes were created. The authors noted that long time ago, near the lake where drooped the willow, and way down in Raccoon Hollow, were borrowed from African American songs. There had been a renewed interest in these songs through the Port Royal Experiment 1861, where newly freed African American plantation workers successfully took over operation of Port Royal Island plantations in 1861, where they had formerly been enslaved. Northern abolitionist missionaries, educators, and doctors came to oversee Port Royal's development. The authors noted that by 1867, the first 7 spirituals in this collection were regularly sung at church. In 1869, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who commanded the 1st African American Regiment of the Civil War, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers recruited, trained, and stationed at Beaufort, South Carolina from 1862 to 1863. Higginson admired the former slaves in his regiment, saying, "It was their demeanor under arms that shamed the nation into recognizing them as men." He mingled with the soldiers and published his 1869 memoir Army Life in a Black Regiment, in which he included the lyrics of selected spirituals. During the Civil War, Higginson wrote down some of the spirituals he heard in camp. Almost all their songs were thoroughly religious in their tone, and were in a minor key both as to words and music. Starting in 1871, the Fisk Jubilee Singers began touring, creating more interest in the spirituals as concert repertory. By 1872, the Jubilee Singers were publishing their own books of songs, which included the Gospel Train. Reverend Alexander Reed had attended a Fisk Jubilee Singers performance in 1871 and suggested they add several songs to their repertoire. Reed, who had been a superintendent at the Spencerville Academy in Oklahoma in Choctaw Nation territory in the 1850s, had heard two workers enslaved by the Choctaw people, an African-American couple, Wallace Willis and his wife Minerva, singing their favorite plantation songs from their cabin door in the evenings. They had learned the songs in Mississippi in their early youth. Reed provided the Jubilee Singers with the lyrics of "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," "Roll, Jordan, Roll," "The Angels Are Coming," "I'm a-Rolling," and "Steal Away to Jesus," and others that Willis and his wife had sung. The Jubilee Singers popularized Willis' songs. Popularization. Fisk Jubilee Singers popularized spirituals. The original Fisk Jubilee Singers, a touring a cappella male and female choir of 9 students of the newly established Fisk School in Nashville, Tennessee, who were active from 1871 to 1878, popularized Negro spirituals. The name Jubilee referred to the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, a time of the emancipation of slaves. On January 9, 1866, shortly after the end of the American Civil War 1861, to May 9, 1865, the American Missionary Association founded the Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, the historically black college. As a school fundraiser, the Fisk Jubilee Singers had their first tour on what is now called Jubilee Day, October 6, 1871. The first audiences were small, local, and skeptical, but by 1872 they performed at Boston's World Peace Festival and at the White House, and in 1873 they toured Europe. In their early days, the Jubilee Singers did not sing the slave songs. Shepard, who also composed and arranged music, explained how slave songs, like those published in the 1867 Slave Songs, had not initially been part of the singers' repertoire because the songs were sacred to our parents, who used them in their religious worship and shouted over them. Shepard said that it was only after many months that gradually our hearts were opened to the influence of these friends, and we began to appreciate the wonderful beauty and power of our songs. Eventually their repertoire began to include these songs. At 230 by 1878, the singers had disbanded. In 1890, the singers' legacy was revived when Ella Shepard, one of the original 9 Fisk Jubilee Singers, returned to Fisk and began to coach new Jubilee vocalists, including John Wesley Work Jr. 1871–1925. At 253 in 1899, Fisk University President E. M. Cravath put out a call for a mixed male and female Jubilee Singers ensemble that would tour on behalf of the university. At 253, the full mixed choir became too expensive to tour and was replaced by John Work Roman II's male quartet. The quartet received widespread acclaim and eventually made a series of best-selling recordings for Victor in December 1909. Also known as John Work Roman II spent 3 decades at Fisk University, collecting and promulgating the Jubilee songcraft of the original Fisk Jubilee Singers, and in 1901 he co-published New Jubilee Songs as sung by the Fisk Jubilee Singers with his brother Frederick J. Work. From 1890 through 1919, African Americans made significant contributions to the recording industry in its formative years, with recordings by the Fisk Jubilee Singers and others. Hampton Singers. In 1873, the Hampton Singers formed a group in Hampton, Virginia, at what is now known as Hampton University. They were the first ensemble to rival the Jubilee Singers. With Robert Nathaniel Dett (1882–1943) as conductor until 1933, Hampton Singers earned an international following. Tuskegee Institute Quartet. The first formal a cappella Tuskegee Quartet was organized in 1884 by Booker T. Washington, who was also the founder of the Tuskegee Institute. Since 1881, Washington had insisted that everyone attending their weekly religious services should join in singing African American spirituals. The quartet was formed to promote the interest of Tuskegee Institute. In 1909, a new quartet was formed. The singers traveled intermittently until the 1940s. Like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, the Tuskegee Institute singers sang spirituals in a modified harmonized style. The concert spiritual tradition. African American composers Harry Burleigh, R. Nathaniel Dett, and William Dawson created a new repertoire for the concert stage by applying their Western classical education to the spirituals. They brought spirituals to concert settings and mentored the next generation of professional spirituals musicians starting in the early 20th century. Harry Burleigh's 1866–1949, an African-American classical composer and baritone, performed in many concert settings, published Jubilee Songs of the United States in 1929, which made spirituals available to solo concert singers as art songs for the first time. 102 Burleigh arranged spirituals with a classical form. He was also a baritone who performed in many concert settings. He introduced classically trained artists, such as Antonin Dvorak, to African American spirituals. 131 Some believe that Dvorak was inspired by the spirituals in his symphony from the New World. He coached African American soloists, such as Marian Anderson, as solo classical singers. Others, such as Roland Hayes and Paul Robeson, continued his legacy. 284 Burleigh published Jubilee Songs of the United States in 1929, which made spirituals available to solo concert singers as art songs for the first time. 102 R. Nathaniel Dett (1882–1943) is known for his arrangements that incorporated the music and spirit of European Romantic composers with African American spirituals. In 1918, he said, "We have this wonderful store of folk music, the melodies of an enslaved people, but it will be of no value if it is not used. We must treat spirituals in such manner that it can be presented in choral form, in lyric and operatic works, in concertos and suites and salon music." 280 R. Nathaniel Dett was a mentor to Edward Boatner (1898–1981), an African-American composer who wrote many popular concert arrangements of the spirituals. Boatner and Willett A. Townsend published Spirituals Triumphant Old and New in 1927. Boatner maintained the importance of authenticity regarding the collection and transcription of spirituals, but also clearly identified with the new, stylized, and polished ways in which they were arranged and performed. 102 William L. Dawson (1876–1938), a composer, choir director, music professor, and musicologist, is known, among other accomplishments, for the world premiere by the Philadelphia Orchestra of his 1934 Negro Folk Symphony, which was revised with added African rhythms in 1952. One of his most popular spirituals is Ezekiel Saw the Wheel. Spirituals in contemporary life. The Fisk Jubilee Singers continue to maintain their popularity in the 21st century with live performances in locations such as Grand Ole Opry House in 2019 in Nashville. In 2019, Tazewell Thompson presented a cappella musical entitled Jubilee that is a tribute to the Fisk Jubilee Singers. Spirituals remain a mainstay, particularly in small black churches, often Baptist or Pentecostal, in the Deep South. The latter half of the 20th century saw a resurgence of the spiritual. This trend was impacted strongly by composers and musical directors such as Moses Hogan and Basil Dennard. Arthur Jones founded the Spirituals Project at the University of Denver in 1999. Everett McCorvey founded the American Spiritual Ensemble in 1995, a group of about 24 professional singers who tour performing spirituals in the United States and abroad. The group has produced several CD, including The Spirituals, and is the focus of a public broadcasting documentary. Stylistic origins and qualities. Qualities of the spirituals include mastery of the blending of voices, timing, and intonation. Spirituals were originally unaccompanied monophonic songs. The tempo in some songs may be slowed down at times retardando, as in the case of sorrow songs and slash, or to showcase the beauty and blending of the voices. Along with the solo call and unison response, songs may include overlapping layers and spine-tingling falsetto humming. Stylistic origins include African music, Christian hymns, work songs, field holler, and Islamic music. According to a McGraw-Hill publication for grade school, spirituals were sung as lullabies and play songs. Some spirituals were adapted as work songs. Black spirituals' use of microtonally flatted notes, syncopation, and counter rhythms marked by hand clapping in black spiritual performances. It stands out for the singer's striking vocal timbre that features shouting, exclamations of the word glory, and raspy and shrill falsetto tones. Numerous rhythmical and sonic elements of spirituals can be traced to African sources, including prominent use of the pentatonic scale, the black keys on the piano. 6-8 in his 1954 book Studies. Call and response. University of Denver professor Arthur Jones, who established the Spirituals Project in 1998 out of the university's Lamont School of Music, described how coded words could be introduced in the call and response overlap, which only insiders aware of the encrypted message could understand. 51-55 he described already existing 51-55 sorrow songs. Slave songs were called sorrow songs by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. Sorrow songs are spirituals, such as Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child and Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. Songs that are intense and melancholic are sung at a slower pace. Jubilee Songs. The Fisk Jubilee Singers had been so successful that other groups were created to perform similar music. Over time, the term Jubilee was used to refer to other ensembles who sang the original group's repertoire. In the early 1900s, Jubilee Singers also referred to singers who performed gospel music and hymns as well as spirituals. Examples of these early 19th century groups include the Norfolk Jubilee Quartet, the Utica Jubilee Singers, and the Tuskegee Institute Singers. Jubilee songs, also known as camp meeting songs, such as And Fare Ye Well and Rocking My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham, are fast-paced, rhythmic, and often syncopated. Spiritual songs, which looked forward to a time of future happiness or deliverance from tribulation, were often known as jubilees. In some churches, such as the Pentecostal Church in the 1910s and 1920s in New Orleans, there was no organ or choir and music was louder, more exuberant, and included up-tempo spirituals called jubilees. They used the drum, the cymbal, the tambourine, and the steel triangle. Everybody in there sang, and they clapped and stomped their feet, and sang with their whole bodies. They had a beat, a rhythm we held on to from slavery days, and their music was so strong and expressive. 52-53. Freedom songs. Work songs. In the 1927 anthology, The American Song Bag, compiled by Carl Sandburg, 1878-1967, the American poet and folklorist, he wrote that Ain't Gone to Study War No Mo was an example of a spiritual that African Americans used as work songs. He said that, as the singers go on, hour by hour, They bring in lines from many other spirituals. The tempo is vital, never actually monotonous, never ecstatic, yet steady in its onflow, sure of its pulses. It is a work sung spiritual. War is pronounced wa or wah, as if to rhyme with saw. Horse is hoss. And so on with Negro economy of vocables in speech and song. 481, 81. Field hollers. Field holler music, also known as levee camp holler music, was an early form of African American music described in the 19th century. Field hollers laid the foundations for the blues, spirituals, and eventually rhythm and blues. Field hollers, cries and hollers of the enslaved people, and later sharecroppers working in cotton fields, prison chain gangs, railway gangs, Gandhi dancers, or turpentine camps were the precursor to the call and response of African American spirituals and gospel music. Derivatives. Blues and gospel music are derivatives of African American spirituals. The blues. In the early 1960s, Blues People by Amiri Baraka, the chosen name for Leroy Jones' 1934-2014, provided a history of African Americans through their music, beginning with the spirituals to the blues. By 1967, Jones had become the main spokesperson for African American intellectuals, displacing James Baldwin, according to a 1965 review of Blues People. The blues form originated in the 1860s in the Deep South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Texas states that were most dependent on the slave labor on plantations and that held the largest number of enslaved people. The form was collectively developed by generations and communities of enslaved African Americans, starting as unaccompanied work songs of the plantation culture. The historical roots of the blues have been traced farther back to West African sources by scholars such as Paul Oliver and Gerhard Kubik, with elements such as the responsorial leader and chorus form. At 1013, the blues became the most extensively recorded of all traditional music types, and since the early 1960s, the most important single influence on the development of Western popular music, and are now widespread. 131, 31, 31, 31, 31, 31, 31, 1, and then 1 is 1, and then 1. He won, and 1 is 1, he won, and 1 is 131. He won. When Mamie Smith's August 10, 1920, oak recording of the composer Perry Bradford's 1893-1970 New York City Crazy Blues became a commercial success, it opened the commercial record market for music for an African American audience. Prior to the success of this recording, commercial recording companies featured non-African American musicians playing African American music. A 343.5 Bradford's African American band, the Jazz Hounds, played live, improvised, unpredicatable, breakneck music that was a refreshing contrast to the buttoned-up versions of the blues interpreted by white artists across the 1910s. A 1976 book, Stomping the Blues by Albert Murray, said that this interaction between Christianity and African American spirituals occurred only in the United States. Africans who converted to Christianity in other parts of the world, even in the Caribbean and Latin America, did not evolve this particular form. Gospel songs. Sacred music includes both spirituals and gospel music, which originated in the Black church and has become a globally recognized genre of popular music. She said that blues are the songs of despair. Gospel songs are the songs of hope. When you sing gospel, you have a feeling there's a cure for what's wrong. When you're through with the blues, you've got nothing to rest on. 52 Horace Clarence Boyer traced the emergence of gospel music through the great migration of African American from the South to the North, especially in the 1930s. Gospel songs entered the mainstream of American popular culture. Gospel music had its heyday from 1945 to 1955, the golden age of gospel. Gospel quartets, like the Golden Jubilee Quartet and the Golden Gate Quartet, changed the style of spirituals with their innovative, Jubilee style, which included new harmonies, syncopation with sophisticated arrangements. An example of their music was their performance of O Jonah. The Golden Gate Quartet, who were active from 1934 to the late 1940s, performed in the concert from Spirituals to Swing at Carnegie Hall in the late 1930s. Zora Neale Hurston, in her 1938 book The Sanctified Church, criticized what she called Glee Club style of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Tuskegee Institute Quartet, and Hampton Singers in the 1930s. She said they were using a style that was full of musicians' tricks that were not authentic to their roots in the original African American spirituals. The authentic spirituals could only be found in the unfashionable Negro church. White spirituals. In his 1938 book, White Spirituals in the Southern Uplands, Vanderbilt University's George Pullen Jackson in Nashville drew attention to the existence of a white spiritual genre, which differed in many aspects from African American spirituals. The core of Jackson's argument, however, supported by many musical examples, is that African American spirituals draw heavily on textual and melodic elements found in white hymns and spiritual songs. Jackson extended the term spirituals to a wider range of folk hymnody, but this does not appear to have been widespread usage previously. The term, however, has often been broadened to include subsequent arrangements into more standard European American hymnotic styles, and to include post-emancipation songs with stylistic similarities to the original African American spirituals. Islamic influence. The historian Sylvian Diouf and ethnomusicologist Gerhard Kubik identify Islamic music as an influence. Diouf notes a striking resemblance between the Islamic call to prayer originating from Bilal ibn Rabah, a famous Abyssinian African Muslim in the early 7th century, and 19th century field holler music, noting that both have similar lyrics praising God, melody, note changes, words that seem to quiver and shake in the vocal cords, dramatic. She attributes the origins of field holler music to African Muslim slaves who accounted for an estimated 30% of African slaves in America. According to Kubik, the vocal style of many blues singers using melisma, wavy intonation, and so forth is a heritage of that large region of West Africa that had been in contact with the Arabic Islamic world of the Maghreb since the 7th and 8th centuries. There was particularly a significant trans-Saharan cross-fertilization between the musical traditions of the Maghreb and the Sahel. There was a difference in the music performed by the predominantly Muslim Sahelian slaves and the predominantly non-Muslim slaves from coastal West Africa and Central Africa. The Sahelian Muslim slaves generally favored wind and string instruments and solo singing, whereas the non-Muslim slaves generally favored drums and group chants. Plantation owners who feared revolt outlawed drums and group chants, but allowed the Sahelian slaves to continue singing and playing their wind and string instruments, which the plantation owners found less threatening. Among the instruments introduced by Muslim African slaves were ancestors of the banjo. While many were pressured to convert to Christianity, the Sahelian slaves were allowed to maintain their musical traditions, adapting their skills to instruments such as the fiddle and guitar. Some were also allowed to perform at balls for slaveholders, allowing the migration of their music across the Deep South. Notable songs. These notable spirituals were written or widely adopted by African Americans. Footnotes.